Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event, the last in this term's series of research seminars hosted by the British Centre for Literary Translation at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. My name is Duncan Large. I'm the BCLT's academic director and coordinator of the research seminar. As with previous events, this seminar is being recorded, and we are planning to make the recording available soon on BCLT's YouTube channel. I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, who is Hilary Brown. Hilary is Senior Lecturer in Translation Studies at the University of Birmingham. Before going to Birmingham, she was lecturer in German at Swansea University, where she and I were colleagues and co-organized together the conference, The Author Translator in the European Tradition, in 2010. Hilary has published widely on the cultural history of translation in the period 1500 to 1800, including a monograph on the neglected translations of Germany's first prominent woman of letters, Louise Gottsched, the translator, which came out from Camden House in 2012, and an edition of Gottsched's translation of Pope's The Rape of the Lock with the Modern Humanities Research Association in 2014. Hilary's next monograph on women and early modern cultures of translation beyond the female tradition was funded by a Humboldt Fellowship from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation and is forthcoming from Oxford University Press. Till the end of January 2022, Hilary is a Mercator Fellow on the DFG Priority Program Übersetzungskulturen der frühen Neuzeit, Early Modern Translation Cultures, 1450 to 1800. And in May, she will be a keynote speaker at the Leuven Conference, Gender, Networks and Collaboration Across Cultures and History. Before I hand over to Hilary, let me just say that after her talk, we'll have plenty of time for questions. We're using the Zoom webinar platform. That means there's a Q&A button, and that's the best way of submitting your questions. That allows you to upvote others' questions as well, any that you would particularly like to see answered. So that function will be available all the way through. Do feel free to submit your questions and I'll put them to Hilary on your behalf at the end. The chat is also available throughout the seminar. For now, though, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Hilary for her talk, which is titled Feminist Translation Practices, Historical Perspectives. Hilary, welcome.
Thank you very much, Duncan. Thank you for the kind invitation and the introduction. It's been so exciting to see these hellos from all over the world in the chat. So thank you to all of you for joining us. I'm going to share my screen because I've got a PowerPoint. So yes, it's a real pleasure to be speaking to you today at this BCLT research seminar. This is the book that Duncan just mentioned. And when Duncan invited me to give this talk, he said, tell us about your new book. As Duncan mentioned, this is coming out in early next year sometime. And it's a book about translation history. It explores the significance of gender in translation history based on existing scholarship on early modern England and on my own work on early modern Germany. So it looks at the 16th and the 17th centuries. And I tried to think about which aspects of this project might be most interesting for today's audience. An audience of people interested in literary translation, maybe practicing or aspiring literary translators or literary translation scholars. And I think it's the chapter on methods. So I'm going to tell you about what I found when I started looking at women's translation methods, in the hope that this will generate an interesting discussion about how we think about methods today. I think I should probably say at the outset that I see this as a contribution to a field which has really been newly invigorated recently. The field of feminist translation studies calls itself FTS. Even if some of my comments in this talk may make me sound a bit like a fifth columnist. So today's talk is going to be divided into three parts. We'll start with we'll start in the present. This is a brief part where we'll be thinking about what feminist translation looks like, and I'll be showing some examples which are probably familiar to many of you. In the second part, we will go back into the past. This is a longer second part, and we'll look at some of the famous examples of early feminist translators in the English Renaissance, whose work has often been evoked to justify the practices of today's feminist translators. Now, my research has led me to question the neatness of this origin story. I don't think that the Renaissance women were necessarily as bold and subversive and feministy as some modern day feminists would like them to have been. And in the final part, we'll come back into the present, think about the future, and ask really what happens if we question the origin story of feminist translation. Are insights from historical study likely to have any significant bearing on the practice and analysis of literary translation in the future? I obviously don't have the answers to those questions, but I'm very interested in generating discussion about them. So, the present. What does feminist translation look like? I'm going to give only a brief summary, picking out a couple of examples from Canada and Spain, and my focus is on literary translation. Of course, feminist translation or gender is an issue in all sorts of texts. Translators have to make decisions all the time about how to render what you might call politically correct language or inclusive language in their target language. Olga Castro, for one, has drawn up guidelines for feminist non-sexist translation practice applicable in a range of non-literary genres. But we're going to be thinking about feminist literary translation. Feminist translation practices were famously pioneered by the so-called Canadian school in the 80s and 90s. The Canadians were typically translating contemporary writers from Quebec from French into English, and the writing they chose was often experimental feminist writing, which critiqued conventional misogynistic language and sought to foreground female experiences. And they took an interventionist approach. So here's one of them quoted as saying that their aim was to make the feminine visible in language so that women are seen and heard in the real world. More recently, there have been various efforts to apply more up-to-date ideas about gender and intersectionality to translation practice. But what I would call the purist conceptualization of feminist practices is still quite persistent, as far as I can see. And I've given you some quotations here from a fairly recent article by Castro and Ergun, who talk about feminist translation still being linked to intervention and an ethical celebratory recognition of the translator's visibility. So let's look for a minute at those strategies. Louisa from Floto has written useful overviews of feminist translation strategies, and in recent articles she separates these into macro strategies and micro strategies. Others have critiqued and modified Floto's ideas, but she's still the authority to whom many still turn. So under macro strategies, there are 2 bullet points there. The first one is about choice of text. So we've already seen that feminist translators in the 80s and 90s often chose experimental feminist writing in French or English. Feminist translators with a more gender-based or intersectional approach might be considering different issues in their choice of source text, such as how to make the voices of multiply marginalized groups such as third world women writers heard in translation. And the second bullet point there is about the addition of paratextual material, such as prefaces and footnotes. And this was linked originally to the idea about making the translator visible. So the Canadian translator and critic Barbara Goddard talked about woman handling your source text, arguing that feminist translators needed to flaunt their presence to counterbalance traditional notions of the subservient or invisible female translator, a woman or translator. These ideas about macro strategies have been modified by people such as Carol Meyer and Françoise Massadia-Kenny, for example, into a notion of commentary, where you might write a preface exploring the relevance of gender in the work of a source text author from a more post-structuralist perspective. So that's the macro strategies. The micro strategies, what's happening at text level, are famously supplementing and hijacking, although Floto seems to have distanced herself a bit from those terms in more recent work. Supplementing is a form of compensation where you develop the source text, give it an afterlife. Hijacking is more interventionist. This is about adding your own political spin to the source text, maybe correcting the source text to emphasize feminine or feminist aspects. And I'm going to give you an example of each of those. The supplementing example is from the Canadian school. So this is experimental feminist poetry written in the 80s, which was about sort of writing the female body. I don't think I'm going to attempt to read you either of those quotations on the slide, but you can see there what this looked like. In the source text, you'll note sound is just as important as meaning. Note the repetition of the L sound, including in the neologism fricatel. In the English target text, this has been supplemented or compensated for with the repetition of she. Okay, and a hijacking example. This concerns a case in Galicia, which was portrayed in the media as mad feminist hijacking, but was much more gentle than that, more like the non-sexist translation practice advocated by Olga Castro. It was a translation of Mark Haddon's novel, The Curious Instance of the Dog in the Nighttime, by a self-identified feminist translator. And what she did, you can see there, is where there were gender-neutral words in English like police or windsurfer, she often translated those with a gender-neutral or feminine noun. The publisher objected to this and wanted to replace them with masculine nouns. He refused to publish her version and the case went to court. So that's the end of the first section. We can see feminist translation practices have been controversial from the beginning and they've been critiqued on various counts. Feminist translators have often justified their position by referring to their foremothers, and in particular the subversive and interventionist women translators of the English Renaissance. So this has become almost the sort of origin story for feminist translation and for FTS, for the field which calls itself FTS, Feminist Translation Studies. This is just one example. This is Barbara Goddard. We've already heard Barbara Goddard, the one who advocated woman handling your source text. She was one of the feminist translators associated with the Canadian school, as well as a translation critic. And this is Goddard writing in the Encyclopedia of Literary Translation in English. She says, expanding the canon by finding evidence of women's literary activities in the past constitutes a tradition to legitimate the practices of today's women translators. So she's quite explicit about it. And in her article, she links contemporary practice to the history of women translators, notably in the English Renaissance, whose work is distinguished by what she calls strong translation practices and significant changes. Other feminist translators and critics have evoked women translators in the past to justify what they are doing now in the 20th and 21st centuries. To begin with, I had lots and lots of examples that I tried to pack onto a slide. I've given some references there. You find this repeated in a lot of work, people referring to a feminist tradition which is seen as starting in the English Renaissance. But I would say, based on the work that I've been doing, that it's time to interrogate the foundations of this origin story. And we're now going to turn to three what you might call beacons of interventionist feminist translation, and look again at the assumptions underlying their work. I'm going to try to show or argue that it's unlikely that they were feminists or proto-feminists with a political agenda to undermine patriarchy through their translations. In fact, it's much more difficult to label and judge the methods of early women translators than many accounts assume. So the first one here is Margaret Tyler. The story of feminist translation often begins with Margaret Tyler. She translated a Spanish chivalric romance rather than religious texts like many of her female contemporaries, and critics love her preface in which she justifies her work. So you can see it's been called a feminist manifesto, and by Goddard, in that article that I've just been talking about, the most radical departure from feminine silence and invisibility during this period. Our second beacon is Elizabeth I. Elizabeth did various translations of literary and philosophical and religious texts throughout her life, but there's been quite a lot of focus on this one, which she did in her youth, the translation of a text by Marguerite de Navarre. Critics, here we have Goddard again, have argued that she personalized or feminized the target text. Someone has said she made startling deviations to insert personal and political statements. In this quotation I've given you from Goddard, when she talks about Elizabeth altering the image of God as a loving father to that of a loving mother, I think she's suggesting that Elizabeth changed the genders to underline her place within a line of female power, given that the source text was written by a French queen. And our final beacon is Afroben. Her dates are a bit later. She's more Restoration than Renaissance, really, but she's another often quoted example. Ben did, she's known obviously as a playwright, but she did various translations as well, and critics have often written about her translation of Fontenelle's Entretien sur la pluralité des mondes. Cartegnis here talks about her interventions in the text, pointing to a feminist agenda. So Cartegnis argues that she had an overt political and feminist agenda. She talks about how Ben changes some of the references to men and women. And then she says, through this political act, Ben, in an absolutely unprecedented way, makes women feature in the philosophical discourse on an equal footing with men. So what the beacons have in common is that they are interventionist. In these accounts, they are using techniques like prefacing and hijacking, just like the feminist translators at the end of the 20th century. And the beacons are held up against the majority of women translators in the English Renaissance who opted instead for what is called a faithful approach to their sources. And we're just going to think about that for a minute. Critics say most translations by women were literal or faithful, and they link this to the position of women in Renaissance society, such as expectations that women should be silent and obedient. Critics have been making these arguments since the 80s. So I've given you one example from the 80s, when the critic is saying the translations by Renaissance women are different from the translations by Renaissance men in being exceedingly literal. But they are still making them to some extent today. Here you see a fairly recent book by Goddard, actually called Faithful Translators, Authorship, Gender and Religion in Early Modern England. Goddard remarks that women don't always stick to faithfulness, but she suggests that they felt more bound to this approach than men. And running through this type of criticism is an implicit disappointment with the faithful translators. Goddard herself uses the term faithful and conservative interchangeably. It's always implied that translating freely would be more laudable as it permits the translator to show her skill and her creativity and her feminist politics. So this account of Renaissance translators is often repeated, but has not very often been interrogated, although there is a strain of revisionist research now. I think that there are some methodological problems with it, and I'm going to outline some of these on the next 3 slides. The first issue is to do with describing the product of translation, and I think that there has been a lack of theoretical sophistication in many descriptions of the translation product. So these terms faithful and free are used a lot, but they're terms that belong to pre-20th century translation theory and are now recognised by translation scholars as being problematic for all sorts of reasons. It's pointed out that translators rarely follow one approach consistently. You even find that in the criticism, people discussing the same translation. Some people say it's fairly free and others saying, oh, it's fairly faithful. So they're subjective terms. Recent critics would emphasize that describing a translation in this way signals a view of translation as the reproduction of a single stable source which possesses qualities of invariance, and this ignores post-structuralist thinking about the instability of meaning within texts. So here is Karen Emmerich, quite deliciously, I think, on the impossibility of faithfulness. She says, translation has no truck with modest changes. The entire translation is a text which didn't exist before. All the words are added, all the words are different. So how can we systematically describe and evaluate the translation product? Well, this is something that translation scholars have thought about a lot, and I don't think it's an issue which has been solved satisfactorily yet. I'd be really interested to know what members of the audience think about this, actually. What's your perspective on this as theorists and practitioners of literary translation? It seems to me that recent commentators on literary translation seem to reject oversimplistic and binary labels, such as domestication and foreignization or documentary and instrumental. And they describe literary translation as a kind of balancing act between versions of these 2 poles. So I'm thinking, for example, of Jean Bose-Bayer or Chantal Wright or Frances Jones. This may be taking us off at a bit of a tangent, but I would be really interested to hear how you talk about literary translation at BCLT and further afield. I should say, for my part, I've got no further than opting for the terms source text oriented and target text oriented, but I feel I'm aware that they are not really much more precise than free and faithful. Okay, so the second methodological issue is to do with establishing the source texts. This is related to the issue of source text analysis. You need to be certain about which source or sources and which version of the source and sources a translator has employed to do any kind of meaningful analysis of what happens in translation. For early modern translation, this is often hard and sometimes impossible to reconstruct. So a translator will rarely tell you precisely what she had in front of her. If it's one source text, which one? Source texts are never single stable entities, as Emmerich has reminded us recently, but typically exist in variant versions and editions. So she says here, the source, the presumed object of translation, is not a stable ideal, not an inert gas, but a volatile compound that experiences continual textual reconfigurations. The works we translate often exist in multiple manuscripts, prints, or digital forms. Or did the translator have more than one source text? The use of multiple sources, including but not limited to intermediary translations, was common at this time. This may have been particularly the case in England, as Boucher points out in the second quotation, due to the comparatively low status of the vernacular. But unless you know for sure what sources a translator was using, then the choices that you attribute to her may well actually be due, for example, to the work of another editor or translator. And my third point is that translation choices are not only due to the choices of individual translators anyway. This is something translation scholars recognise, and they recognise that attributing choices to the agency of individuals is too simplistic. Here are some of the questions that are asked in various subfields of the discipline. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but you see, for example, on translator style, you can't start out from the premise that a woman's translation practices are governed by her consciousness of being a woman. Some shifts, some changes will be obligatory because of the nature of the source. Some can be attributed to the style and intention of the translator. Then there are questions asked by people who are interested in systems theories. If translations are embedded within cultural, literary and social systems, how do factors which control these systems dictate or influence the strategies used in translations, such as norms? There are sociological theories which ask how a translator's actions are conditioned by his or her experiences as a social agent. There's the whole area of collaboration, which is quite a new one. I'm thinking of work by people like Helen Smith, who recognise that book production is the result of the work of lots of different agents, including translations, obviously. I think that when you start looking at these sorts of questions and at the wider context and at things such as norms, then there is less difference between the translation practices of women and their male contemporaries than some critics have made out. Let's return to Elizabeth I for a moment. Elizabeth's translation method in her translation of Margaret Tyler was probably influenced by her age, by her education, by the context in which she was working, rather than her gender. And this is something that has been pointed out, for example, by Roger Ellis in his article of 2009. Princess Elizabeth was 11 years old when she did this manuscript translation, and it seems highly likely that she wasn't pursuing a feminist agenda, but was influenced by her environment. So factors such as her educational experience, translation norms, and the influence of agents such as her tutors, her stepmother Catherine Parr, to whom the volume was presented, or her father King Henry VIII. For example, it can be described as source text orientated, but this fits norms for schoolroom translations at the time, arising from the practice of double translation, which was the exercise of turning English into Latin and then back into English, or Latin into English and then back into Latin. And this probably encouraged thinking about the source and target in terms of one-to-one correspondences. There is actually a theory which says we should see Princess Elizabeth as the very opposite of feminist. And this is a very compelling article by Frances Teague. She says that Elizabeth may have been set to translation in her youth so that the material objects she produced, which were beautiful holograph manuscripts and embroidered covers, could be used like portraits in marriage negotiations. So she suggests that they were prepared as potential gifts for foreign grooms, and she's got a lot of really good evidence to support this theory. So she says that the translations would have advertised Elizabeth's credentials as chaste, pious, fashionable, and so on. And I'm not going to read you this whole quotation, but I just wanted to show you how Teague links sort of the material objects that Princess Elizabeth produced to the way that it was advertising Elizabeth's credentials. So, you know, she links this to the dedicatory letter, to the handwriting, to the embroidery and the care and elegance of the embroidery, and so on. So rather than searching for female agency in Elizabeth's translations, Teague urges us to appreciate the specific historical context in which Elizabeth was working and to consider her instead as an obedient child bride. So here in this section, I'm coming to the end of section 2 now, I've kind of whizzed you through chapter 4 of my book without even mentioning any German women. I've got a lot more material to support what I'm trying to argue here. And I've just tried to summarize it a bit on the final slide of this section. This is the crux of it, really. Looking at methods, I had to conclude that there didn't really seem to be much difference between the work of women and men translators. Translation practice was potentially influenced by a range of factors such as age, education, religious and political ideology, as well as gender, and also by what you might call external factors such as translation norms. It's quite hard to label norms. There's a lot of variety. There's a lot of interventionism, but generally it seems that some kind of middle way in Neil Rhodes' formulation or mixed methods approach is quite dominant. And I also had to conclude that the focus on methods may be a bit of a distraction. It was the function of translation which was probably more important. In most cases, most early modern translators probably didn't give their methods much thought. It was the act of creating a translation in itself often had symbolic meaning. So we've seen a few hints of that already in the case of the young Princess Elizabeth, who may have been creating an advert for her marriageability. The same is true for the older Elizabeth. Actually, she produced manuscript translations which nobody read, but everyone knew about, everyone at court. And it's been argued that this was she did it in order to, well, for self-fashioning, to project an image of herself as a reflective, intellectual, good Christian, in effect as a good ruler. Now, this is rather different from the traditional feminist narrative. And in the final part of this talk, I want to come back to the present and think about whether any of this has any significance for the present and the future. Okay, so here we are, part 3. Revisionist work on the Renaissance, and as I said, I'm not the only person who has been doing this kind of research. It seems, in a sense, to undermine the feminist translation project. But I do wonder if the purist form of feminist translation, so calls for visibility and interventionism, was always perhaps more of an aspiration than a reality, and was always in danger of attracting charges of elitism or seeming suspect or unenticing, in the words of my Birmingham colleague, Peter Auger. Floto has repeatedly emphasised that the Canadian school was associated with a specific historical moment. Ria Monde suggests she's a lone practitioner in contemporary Galicia of this tradition. She calls herself one active feminist translator in Galicia, and her approach constituted very mild feminist translation strategies, what I call minimum intervention. Practitioners of feminist translation have tended to be academics or students undertaking PhD projects, and their work has often been published by niche presses. I've actually struggled to find examples, particularly of feminist micro-strategies, to show my students from languages other than French. If you know of them, let me know. That would be very interesting. So feminist translation hasn't really become mainstream in literary translation. Research suggests that interventionism is unusual, that the norm is domestication in various formats. For example, Frances Jones, who writes that translators' reluctance to breach the ethic of source writer loyalty means that marked deviations are relatively infrequent, even in ideologically charged contexts. And here's an example, contemporary example, which looks like feminist translation, but turns out not really to be. And it's an example discussed in Chantal Wright's book on literary translation from her own practice. The source texts are picture books by the contemporary German author Cornelia Funke. They are feminist stories Wright says, with unconventional female heroines who cleverly subvert the expectations of their gender. From the covers, so from changes to the title and to the cover illustration, they look like they might be examples of feminist translation. So the German Captain Crinkly Beard and his crew has become Pirate Girl in Chantal Wright's target text, and that has a picture of Molly, the young female protagonist, on the front cover instead of Captain Crinkly Beard. But there are no further examples in the target text of feminist translation strategies. Wright discusses the Funke translations as examples of domestication, in fact. And it sounds as if the repackaging, the rebranding has been done by the publisher for commercial reasons. This isn't to say that feminist translation is not important and has no future. And I've been inspired recently by a more positive assessment of feminist translation by my Birmingham colleague, Peter Auger. He recently gave a lunchtime lecture called Why Do We Need Feminist Translation, which you can watch on the University of Birmingham YouTube channel. In that talk, he mentions Emily Wilson, whose 2017 Odyssey is the first complete translation of Homer's poem into English by a woman. Wilson has recently written about her translation as a feminist project, aware of, but not subscribing to the woman handling, the hijacking, the overly interventionist practices of earlier feminist translators, even though her source glorifies androcentric values. Her middle way, to quote Rhodes, seeks to be loyal to the source text, to quote James, making its sexism clear to readers while also not inscribing into her target text the modern sexist attitudes she found in translations by her male contemporaries. Wilson's translation sounds like it can't be easily accused of being either elitist or unenticing. Her ideal reader is Greekless, coming to Homer for the first time, and finds in that translation, she hopes, see in this quotation, a reliable, authoritative substitute for the Greek text that would take its complex representations of social inequality, including gender inequality, more seriously than I felt had been done before. Auger suggests that Maria Davana Headley's Beowulf, published last year and marketed as a new feminist translation, is of the same ilk. Translations which shine a clear light, he says, on older source texts, with the potential for more mainstream acceptance. So I'm going to conclude now. I don't have a concluding slide, just references if anyone's interested. I think this is a really exciting moment. I think there's potential for a really interesting new dialogue between translation historians, translation scholars, theorists, practitioners, and readers. Maybe I can say here, for my part, I've been influenced by the translator and translation scholar Carol Meyer in my approach to gender, my historical research, and I've appropriated her term woman interrogated to describe the type of history that I try to write. Emily Wilson herself describes feminist translation theory as a nascent and still underdeveloped area within both gender and feminist studies and translation studies. So what did it or does it mean to come to translation as a woman and or a feminist? These are questions which remain vital, and I think that there may be more varied and more subtle ways of answering them than we've tended to hear up until now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hilary. What a splendid and thought-provoking presentation. There's already plenty of thanks appearing in the chat. We've had one question appearing in the Q&A as well. And can I encourage our audience, do please place your questions in the Q&A, and then we've got nice time for a question session now. And I will put your questions to Hilary. I also already just put in the chat, just as you were finishing, Hilary, I put a link to Emily Wilson's Zebalt lecture from 2019, when she had recently published her Homer translation, and she gave our annual BCLT Zebalt lecture, and that's well worth checking out. I wonder then if I could start off, Hilary, by just asking. I mean, a number of questions occurred to me. Maybe I'll have an opportunity to put them to you. But you mentioned, for example, that you had some German examples as well, which you weren't really presenting and which were there in the book. So my question really would be then around, around geography, really. I mean, you presented us with some English language examples today. How broad would you want to make your claim geographically then? Would you want to argue that in the early modern period then that the different translation traditions, the different places in which translators were operating were in the same position, or would you want to differentiate?
As an individual researcher, I think it would be impossible to say. And what I'm hoping is that I present enough evidence that is persuasive enough for other people to go and ask these questions about other language areas. So what I did in the book was to concentrate on England and Germany. So I used the research on England as my starting point, because that's the research that everybody knows about the early modern period. And it's really set the tone for work in the field. So I reviewed it critically, and then tried to apply conclusions that I drew from it to Germany, where there's been less of this kind of work. And then I just offer pointers for other scholars to go off and think about this. And I think I found what I was doing quite difficult, because it's very hard, as I've said, for those reasons, to describe what is actually happening in translation, and then to talk about norms is even more difficult. And it's very interesting, but I'm just advocating an approach that is more, I suppose, more contextualizing than has been always in the past.
Thank you. So questions are coming in to the Q&A and to the chat. So perhaps do use the Q&A by preference, and then others can respond and potentially upvote. There was one comment in the chat, though, that I think I'll just read out, and that was a question from Catherine McAteer, or rather a point which says, this has been a really fascinating presentation, thank you. I'm writing my monograph on female translators of Russian literature in the Cold War period, where the sociocultural context appears repeatedly to contradict traditional feminist norms. UK/US female translators who emigrated to the USSR for ideological reasons, including gender equality, to work for state literary translation publishers, entered a professional space where the individual translator's rights and voices were sacrificed for the state's soft power machine. In support of some of the points you've made today, these women were governed by function rather than method, external factors rather than personal motivation. Translation for many of them became a means for survival, not for exercising feminism. And she concludes, I can't wait for your book to come out. So there's another context there. I don't know, Hilary, if you would like to respond to that.
That's fascinating, thank you. I can see that there are 83 comments in the chat. I obviously haven't been able to follow that. I'm just wondering, Duncan, would you be able to save them and send them to me afterwards? Because I'd love to read these sorts of comments and have the work of that kind on my radar. That sounds really fascinating. Thank you very much for telling us about that.
The answer is yes, indeed. I'll save the chat for you, Hilary.
Thanks very much.
There was an early question from an anonymous attendee, simply asking, what do you think of feminist thought and feminist translations in historical works cited by Mary Goddard, and in her book Artemisia Gentileschi and Feminism in Early Modern Europe? That's quite a specific question.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, I don't know that.
Okay.
I'll look it up. Thank you very much for the reference. That looks very relevant. Thank you.
Gabby Viver in the chat asked, says, thank you, Hilary. Really enjoyed that. Can you say more about what you found out about the function of the translations by women in the early modern period? Any clearer patterns than in terms of strategies?
That's a really interesting question. Patterns. Again, I would hesitate to attribute things to the fact that the person producing a translation is a woman. I think the thing about functions is really interesting because I think that has probably been a little bit overlooked in research on early modern translation. There's been a lot of work on the print context, and the argument is usually translations help to spread knowledge and ideas across borders and so on. And I'm, that there is that aspect to it, but then there are also, I think, the sort of the symbolic side of translation has been a little bit neglected. So the fact that people produce translations for all sorts of reasons, and sometimes for a mix of reasons, and I think it's very fascinating. So Warren Boucher is one of the people who has pursued this type of research, saying that people produce translations, men produce them to advertise their language skills if they wanted careers as diplomats and things like that. Or in my context, I don't think I could identify trends that are particularly to do with people being women or men, as I said, but there's a lot of manuscript translation. And some of these translations produced at courts, for example, were useless translations because they were translating things that were available in translation anyway, but they were translating them and presenting them to other members of the court for symbolic reasons. It might be, a child presenting a manuscript to their father at New Year as a sort of expression of their obedience and devotion to a particular educational program. Or it might be the tutor in the background who wants to advertise his skills as a tutor by jointly presenting, writing a preface for a manuscript translation by someone they're tutoring at the court, and so on. So I think there's a lot of work that could still be done on this. I think we have overlooked it a little bit in research on early modern translation. I'm not sure, Gabby, if that answers your question.
A question from, I think it's Julia Kölbel. Could you elaborate on the woman interrogated approach in a bit more detail? I'd be interested in how exactly it helped you gain a broader view of the relation between translation and gender in history.
Yeah, so Carol Meyer talks about this in an article which I'm sure some of you will know. I think it's called Issues in Translating Women's Fiction or something. And she talks about her own career as a feminist translator and how she started out as a sort of traditional feminist translator, and then changed her views on gender and so on. So I really recommend the article. How I used that was to also approach women translators not first and foremost and always primarily as women, but to ask, not as been done in the past, how did gender affect what they did, but ask, did gender affect what they did, and be more aware that other factors might have sort of intersected with gender or been more important with than gender in understanding their activities.
Thank you. A question from Yazid in the chat. What do you think of feminist interventions in translations of sacred texts? I'm referring to perhaps Quran translation because this is my area of expertise, but I'm interested to know what you think about other sacred texts generally.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, isn't it?
I can't remember. I mentioned earlier that we used to be colleagues in Swansea. I can't remember whether I ever showed you, Hilary, that huge Bibel in gerechter Sprache that I acquired about 10 years ago.
Yeah. I've used that as an example with students. That's quite a good example, isn't it, of a team of scholars who quite recently, isn't it, who, well, about 10 or 20 years ago, who produced a new version of the Bible, and they said, if we don't know that women weren't there, we're going to put them in anyway, isn't it? So they have things like shepherds were watching their flocks, and they have in German female shepherds and male shepherds were watching their flocks. It's things like that, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with this sort of what you might think of as sort of purist, feminist, interventionist translation. Not at all. It's it has its place. What I mean, I'd like to know what other people in the audience think about these ideas too. But yeah, I think these projects are very interesting and obviously speak to a need to you know, to there will be readers for them, aren't there? But they're controversial, and I think maybe I don't see them as widespread in contemporary literary translation as they have been perhaps in, for example, Bible translation or a translation of sacred texts. I don't know what you think about
that. Let's take a question from Yvette Siegert. Thank you for this lovely talk, Hilary. And a side question, really, have you had much contact with Émilie du Châtelet's French translation of Newton's Principia? I know it's outside the languages and period you're focused on, but I kept thinking of her throughout your talk, especially trying to think about the function of the project, perhaps as an expression of her own mathematical training. Her case strikes me on a more sociological level, remembering that critics admired the translation so much that they called her a great man, etc.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's been some revisionist work on her and on that translation, hasn't there? So I think in the past, it's sort of people have said, oh, you know, she only translated because she didn't feel confident in her own abilities as a scientist. But more recently, there have been a couple of essays people have said, no, actually, she saw this as an important part of her scientific work, and they compare it to other scientists at the time who also translated and didn't see that in any way as sort of you know, lesser work. It wasn't necessarily women's work or something like that. So I think, again, if you putting her in context, I think she's another example that supports the kind of thing that I'm trying to argue here. Similar to Louisa Gottsched, actually, sort of a kind of contemporary of Louisa Gottsched. Duncan mentioned at the beginning, I wrote a study of her early 18th century German Enlightenment woman who did a lot of translation, including scientific translation. And again, in the case of Louisa Gottsched, I don't think that she had any particular perception of herself as a woman translator. Although some reviewers didn't like me saying that, so I'm a bit nervous about how this book's going to be reviewed, to be honest.
A question in the chat from Gemma, I think it is. Thank you for such an interesting talk. Would you know of any other examples of sexist versus feminist translation in children's literature? Also, would you think that the way in which the cover of the Pirate Girl book was represented in English is also subject to gender perceptions? I haven't read the book, but the German version showed this brave pirate with his troop, whereas the English version only showed the girl calmly lying on the boat.
Ah, that's a good point, isn't it? Yeah, I think I would refer you to Chantal Wright's book here. She has a really interesting discussion of this, and insider information, because it's, you know, obviously this one is her particular translation of a Funke picture book. You asked about other examples of sexist versus feminist translations of children's literature. I'll have a think. If anyone else can think of anything, maybe they could pop it in the chat. That would be interesting, wouldn't it?
There is one response to that previous question in the chat from Jules Wicker. The original pirate ship is still there, just sailing into view on the horizon. So yes, we need to do a bit more semiotic analysis, I think, paratextual.
Thanks, Jules.
paratextual analysis. Zainab Gunal asks, well, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm currently conducting a literature review about establishing an ethical framework for feminist translators. I was wondering if you had any insights or comments on the possibility of forming a universal ethical framework. Do you think it's even possible, given the complex, multicultural, transnational nature of today's feminism?
Yeah, you know, I've been thinking about this too. I've been thinking, wouldn't it be interesting to get together people who are interested in feminist translation or who do feminist translation and see what they do and what they think about it? I'm sure there are really interesting possibilities for conversations like that. I expect you know Olga Castro's edited collection. Now I'm thinking on the spot, I'm not going to be able to remember the title of it. It's from about 2017. Can anyone help me out in the chat? It's about, oh dear. It does, I'm sure it talks about feminist translation and ethics. Some of the essays talk about it. But I can't remember the title of the book off the top of my head. It's something to do with global feminist translation studies in a global perspective or something, maybe. If anyone knows what I'm talking about, please do put it in the chat. Oh, that's it. Yeah, feminist translation studies local. Yeah, that's like the one. That I think is very relevant to the project that you've just been talking about. Thank you very much. Yeah.
And Gabby Viva has put a link in the chat to the GLARE project at Birmingham, which looks at gender in corpora of English children's literature. Martha had a question in the Q&A relating to Olga Castro. In fact, Olga Castro describes feminist translation as an elitist activity. If we put that in an academic context, it would be mostly a practice undertaken by white females. Yet the feminist movement crosses divides of and is often divided by color, ethnicity, class, and so on. How can we align feminist translation practice today with these multiple feminisms to, in fact, be more inclusive?
Yeah, I mean, these are really, really relevant topical questions, aren't they? I think that's something that Olga Castro and Emmy Gunn are really interested in this volume. Louisa von Floto as well has moved in this direction more recently, hasn't she? And she has collaborated with people in other parts of the world and has really been very supportive of publishing work on feminist translation studies from outside, you know, the usual Anglo-American sphere. I can recommend her recent edited volume, which is a Routledge Handbook of Translation, Feminism and Gender, which is really very global in its perspective. And I think that's a really positive development. Absolutely, I think that's 2020, published in 2020.
There's a question, thank you, Hilary. There's a question from Wen Xin. Thank you for your awesome presentation. For the private girl example, sometimes feminist translation is criticized as ideologically overcharged. With this domestication example, would you think this kind of domestication is also kind of overcharging? Could you please talk more about the difference between this kind of domestication and intervention?
Do you mean in, I'm not sure if you mean in the text itself or if you're talking about what we saw on the covers there, because on the covers there's been a bit more interventionism, hasn't there? But in the text itself, you don't really get a sense of that. Sorry, I can't remember what the question was. Sorry, Duncan, can you repeat the question, please?
Yes, sometimes feminist translation is criticized as ideologically overcharged, but with this domestication example, would you think this kind of domestication is also kind of overcharging? So is it going too far the other way?
Well, we haven't looked at any examples of what Chantal Wright was talking about when she talks about domestication. Really, she does talk about the that's right, the cover and the illustration being domesticated for an English audience because we are, yeah, I think she says because we're less used to these sorts of feminist this sort of feminist children's literature than in Germany. Let me just, I think I've got the quotation from her here somewhere. Oh yeah, so she says that changes to the front cover emphasize that these are feminist stories, and this kind of packaging was not needed in Germany, according to Chantal Wright, because the source sex culture seems to be more progressive. So I've got a quotation from her. She says, in the German context, feminist narratives in books for children and teens are more common than they are in the UK. Ironically, the title changes hide the fact that the source culture may be more progressive than the importing culture. So it's to do with marketing, isn't it? And the commercial side of it, I suppose, and whether you can criticize that or see that as some necessary way of selling a translated children's book, I think is a matter of personal opinion, isn't it, really?
There's a question from Anna in the Q&A. Well, forgive my oversimplification, but what do you think might be the relevance of imitatio for female translators in early modern times?
I'd like to ask you to expand on that. Is that going to be possible, Duncan?
Indeed, yes. So Anna, perhaps it's a very short question. Perhaps if you could expand on that a little, and we'll come back to that question. So moving from the early modern times to the present, one anonymous questioner asked a practical question. I manage teams of translators for a global organization. What practical guidance can I give our translators to translate our materials inclusively? What do they need to think about as they translate into multiple languages?
Now, there's going to be another case where I can't quite put my finger on the reference I want to give you, but this is Olga Castro's essay on translating inclusive language in a range of contexts. I might just be able to find it. Hang on. I might have it here. Yes, I have. It is called Non-Sexist Translation and Stroke in Social Change, Gender Issues in Translation, where she is talking about non-sexist translation methods in a range of contexts. And this is published in an edited collection called Translation, Stroke, Interpreting and Social Activism. I think it's 2010. And I would really recommend that as a starting point, at least, for ideas about translating guidelines for feminist, non-sexist translation practice in a range of genres, not just literary translation. Thank you. Someone's put in the reference. That's great. Yeah, thanks very much. It's in the chat. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. A question from Mukili Kasongo. Do you think for a translation to be considered feminist, the translator must be a self-identified feminist or embrace feminist ideology? I'm asking this because in other linguistic and cultural contexts, women reject feminist ideology but might use a feminist method.
Yes, that's a good question, isn't it? It's I think would take quite a long answer. Maybe I'll just make the point. It's quite difficult to actually say sometimes this is a feminist translation. I mean, people pointed out, Floto published quite early on feminist translation strategies. I think she did a useful essay in 1991 where she talked about hijacking and supplementing and so on. And then people said, well, actually, when you talk about supplementing, you're really talking about something that we call compensation. So how do you say that that is in particular a feminist translation practice? And they tried to modify it a little bit and say, well, when it's referring to something to do with women and so on and so on and so on. But I think, you know, you probably need to start out by thinking what actually is a feminist translation, and then I don't see why it matters who's done it and what they say about it. So I think that's probably a separate thing. Does that make sense?
I'd say so. Thanks, Hilary. Catherine McAteer, again, I found this a very refreshing discussion because it validates an alternative approach to women translators, that it doesn't necessarily have to mean feminist translator in the strictest sense. You've mentioned nervousness about how your book, this approach, will be received. How receptive do you think the academic community will be? Personally, I think your work will help scholars like myself to question norms.
I hope the academic community will be receptive. I mean, as I say, I'm not the only person who engages in this kind of revisionist research of the early modern period. I'm obviously very indebted to all the work that has been done on women translators in this period that I've read, and I try to acknowledge my debt and gratitude to earlier generations of scholars, even if I don't necessarily also pursue quite the same approach as them. I think some of the conclusions people draw are quite entrenched because they are sort of repeated in encyclopedia and handbook articles and so on. And I think that it's quite, I think it is, what I'm trying to say probably does go against some of the standard accounts, I think. But I've just tried to give lots of evidence and make a balanced argument, and hope that people will appreciate the kind of scholarly effort that has gone into it, even if they don't like the conclusions. And obviously you don't have to agree with the conclusions or follow that approach, but hopefully they'll, you know, it can generate discussion, you know, even if people disagree with it and draw other conclusions. That's interesting too.
Thanks, Hilary, because I suppose I've been thinking, I mean, your argument today then has been around these earlier beacons, and you've been arguing then that what you've called this sort of origin story for feminist translation in the late 20th century doesn't, if one looks at it more in context at these examples, they don't really stack up, and it's not such a straightforward narrative. And really what you're suggesting, there's a kind of anachronism here about kind of retrofitting, about projecting back to the early modern period these assumptions or these conclusions that have been the result of much more recent work and scholarly inquiry. But that doesn't mean to say, well, it seems to me that doesn't mean to say that it kind of invalidates the current work if you're arguing that the predecessors are not as described. That doesn't mean to say that you're somehow sort of pulling the rug out from under contemporary feminist translators by doing that. Would you agree? I mean, it seems to me that you're arguing for a more kind of rounded, in a sense, this is, one could argue this is a sign of feminist translation studies becoming a more mature discipline by acknowledging that not everything has to be claimed as a feminist translation practice, even in the early modern period. Yeah,
I think so. I think that's my hope, Duncan. Yeah, I think that's it. And as I say, I think there's sort of this, what sometimes seems slightly crude kind of ideas about interventionism and so on are not really widely accepted or practiced anyway now, I think. So yeah, that's what I think, that there are probably synergies between this kind of history writing and the way people are thinking about feminist translation today.
Thank you. There was a question which I missed in the chat. Do pop questions in the Q&A by preference. But from earlier on, Azil asked, thank you for this interesting seminar. I'm just wondering how it's possible to spot which aspect, gender, education, culture, had more influence on their texts than others. So a methodological question then, if you're suggesting that actually the gender of the translator was often less relevant than the kinds of factor that you were setting out there, is it possible to generalize about those other factors? Is it possible to spot in individual cases which are, how is it possible to spot which factor might be more important?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the beginning, the problem was that not so much was known about early modern translation, and people who worked on the women translators got very excited about what they found, and they didn't really compare what the women were doing to what the men were doing. So this is the early work, which again was at the same sort of time as the feminist translators were doing their translations in the 80s and 90s. But since then, there's been it's now an absolutely huge field, studies of early modern translation, particularly in the English context. And there's a lot more data available and a lot more comparative data. So you don't have to look at the women in isolation anymore, but you can look at them in the context of the men around them with whom they often work closely, or where their work can often be compared. So you can compare their work to what men at the time were doing. There are some really good resources for England, like the Renaissance Cultural Crossroads catalogue, which is a database of all translations published in England, Scotland and Ireland up until 1641. And something like that, for a start, gives you sort of reliable statistical data about who was doing what, which people just didn't have when they started looking at women translators in Renaissance England back in the late 80s and early 90s. So, just to give you a sort of very basic example, at that time, people often said, oh, translation was a specifically feminine activity, and it was, allowed women access to intellectual culture, because they weren't producing their own works, they were only translating and so on. But the Renaissance Cultural Crossroads catalogue shows that, for example, in the first half of the 16th century, there were maybe, I think, 40 translations by women, but over 1,000 by men. So there's no way you can say that translation was a specifically feminine activity. You know what I mean? So a lot of what people said before tended to be quite impressionistic, and I think you really need that kind of data to put the work of individuals into a proper context. You can see trends to do with genre and languages and so on. So that is a really important aspect, I think.
Thank you, Hilary. Anna has got back in touch with an expansion on her earlier question about imitatio for female translators in early modern times. She says, I was simply wondering about the paradigm shifts that make the modern critic stroke researcher look for originality and intervention as positive features of literary work and translation. Faithfulness to the text doesn't have the best reputation in feminist translation, but to imitate successfully was not necessarily a gender thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Thank you for adding to your initial question. That's very helpful. Yeah, I think again that's quite something that people have become more aware of more recently, isn't it? People said a lot of women's work in the early modern period is a bit derivative, and translation is part of that, and so on. That there's more recognition now that was actually valued by the culture at that time, and was also not something that was specific to women. Yeah, I'm not saying that there aren't gender differences. I suppose I should add. I think that there are cases and trends where you can attribute things to gender. I do think that gender hasn't lost its relevance as a category for analysing and understanding the work of women translators in the past. Just that thought popped into my head then. I was thinking about imitatio. Sometimes it's to do with what languages a woman is able to learn and has access to, yeah. So yeah, there are things, there are instances where gender is still clearly a relevant factor.
Question from Sophie Stevens. I really enjoyed this talk, and it strikes me that the methodology you set out for interrogating feminist translations could and should be applied to understanding the material, ideological, and historical conditions in which any translation is produced. My question is about the selection of texts to be translated as a feminist practice or act within translation studies and practice. For example, choosing to prioritize translating women from different places, offering different perspectives. Where might this fit into feminist translation studies?
Yeah, I assume you're talking about the contemporary period now. And that is certainly something that, theorists have talked about from the beginning. Like I said, choice of text can be seen as a feminist strategy. Maybe the thing to read here would be Louisa von Floto's article from 2019 in the Routledge Encyclopedia of Translation Studies. She's got some more recent examples in there, I think, as well, about choice of text. So that, yeah, it's certainly an important issue, I think, for feminist translators. And a lot of people have written about that. People who've been uncomfortable with translating very misogynistic male writers and how they've dealt with that and so on. So there's a lot of commentary on this out
there. A question from Elisabetta Wassermann. Thank you for this interesting talk. I'd like to ask Hilary, how would you like to see feminist translation develop?
It's a nice question. Well, I must mention Peter again, who I think was in the audience, at least at the beginning. I don't know if he's got anything to say about this, but this is his the talk he gave recently on feminist translation from the perspective of someone in English studies. Because I was feeling quite pessimistic about the future of feminist translation when I started putting this together, and really listening to him has convinced me that that the future is, that we can be a bit more, maybe more optimistic about the future. I think, and it's become clear as well from what people have been saying in the chat, that these are very relevant, interesting questions that haven't gone away and that are being rethought in really interesting ways. And what I hope is that feminist translation will continue to be a topic that excites exciting research and interesting projects and dialogue between scholars and practitioners and readers and historians and so on. So I think that I would share Emily Wilson's assessment of this still being a field that is in development, rather than one where the kind of the sort of the excitement has gone out of it a little bit. I think it is a really it is still an important and really interesting area that I hope people will continue to talk about.
There have been one or two questions about whether a recording will be available and whether your slides can be shared. I think we can perhaps explore ways of, if you're in agreement, Hilary, sharing your slides via, I think perhaps via Eventbrite. We'll see what we'll work on that. But thank you for your interest in having Hilary's slides afterwards. There's one question from another question, in fact, from Gemma, who asked one earlier. Would you allow a feminist translation strategy to translate a book in which the narrator shows a very integrated sexist ideas in their narrative? Would you hijack all the assumptions they say? Would you leave them and maybe add footnotes, or what would you do? So very practical about how you would approach a sexist text.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I should say I'm not a translator. I'm one of these. A lot of translation scholars are and do translations, but I haven't, or haven't yet. I always think I will in my retirement. So that's not really a question for me, but it's, I think, certainly a question for people to think about, and one I would discuss with my students, and sort of thing that I expect you talk about quite a lot at BCLT.
Oh, indeed, yes.
So yeah, interesting questions.
Perhaps then there's one final question from Noof in the chat. Thank you for your thought-provoking presentation. My question is, you touched upon feminist translation of children's literature. Do you see any parallelism between feminist translations of children's literature and the recent trend for re-narration or reproduction of classic fairy tales from a feminist perspective? Recent remakes of classic Disney films like Aladdin, Cinderella, etc.
Yeah. I think so. I think it, yes, probably. I mean, I can't give a very scholarly answer to that, but I think that, yes, that there is probably increased awareness of these issues more broadly. And there are some great new Disney films. I watched, oh gosh, I'm not remembering the name of it. It's the one about the girl on a desert island, Moana. I watched Moana for the first time recently, and there's not a single prince in sight. Which is, you know, just so unusual when you grew up with old-fashioned Cinderella and Snow White. So yes, I think so. And I think for a more scholarly answer to this, which is sort of related to what you're saying, I would again recommend Peter Auger's talk, because he links projects like Emily Wilson's Odyssey translation to feminist retellings of classical tales. So not for children, but where writers have taken material from Greek and Roman literature and rethought it in feminist terms. And he's got quite a lot of examples that he talks about very interestingly in that lecture.
Fantastic. Well, Hilary, gosh, I mean, the questions have been so wide-ranging, as befits your talk. Really, you've by opening up, by linking up the early modern examples and the 20th and 21st century practice, and thinking about the implications for the future as well. You've really set a lot of people thinking, clearly very productive thoughts, and thank you so much for all your comments in the chat and in the Q&A, and thank you, Hilary, for your very generous responses to those comments. I think we need to wrap up now, but thank you once again for a super presentation. It's been a real pleasure hosting you. It's lovely to see you again after some time, but thank you so much for a super presentation, and thank you all in the audience as well, and hope to see you again after Christmas, when the BCLT research seminar series will resume. But for now, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, everybody.